I'd like to now move into our next session and like to welcome Alexis Davison up on stage. Alexis is the Executive Director, Engineering and Program Services at Major Road Projects Victoria. And most specifically for this discussion, she is one of the main drivers behind ecologiQ and the Recycle First policy. You've heard Kevin talk about how the big build is creating demand for recycled materials and products, but there is, of course, more to be done. Alexis and I are going to now pull back the curtain on some of those popular myths about recycled materials and how, of course, impacting greater use of recycled materials across various infrastructure projects can be brought to life. So we will, of course, be putting your questions to Alexis at the end of the session. So do jump on and send them through. So let's begin.
Thanks, Veena.
Alexis,
I like this much less than I am anxious about people coming to events.
So. Well, we're just going to be sort of chatting and, it's like you're amongst friends.
Yeah.
You're just chatting to a whole bunch of friends. Just a few more than you would have around your dinner table at home, but all good. Well, I guess one of the common things that we keep hearing about when we hear about recycled materials and products, that it's just too hard. There are too many obstacles. What's your experience?
We continue to hear about these, the reasons why it's too hard. I can't find it, it's too expensive, it's inferior, it doesn't meet the spec, won't last as long. And I guess we really want to challenge some of those because it's not always necessarily true. If you think of, and Kev's outlined the impact so far, that's all happened without changing the rules that much. So not being able to find a product that meets a technical specification, I'd challenge everyone to have a look at some of the materials that we've developed to sort of educate our project teams, because you might be quite surprised about what is actually available.
And I mean, of course, people tend to want to always make this point, well, but, okay, it's all well and good to use recycled materials, but, they're really not going to be up to the mark, they're going to be inferior, they're not going to be good enough. All of that kind of, I guess people have got that perception. Maybe it's more a perception rather than reality, but how do you kind of go about addressing that?
I think people need to stop thinking about recycled materials as like-for-like replacement to a traditional alternative. Plastic doesn't behave the same way as concrete. So expecting a plastic pipe to behave like a concrete pipe it just shouldn't be. So we may need to learn how to handle products differently. We may need to learn how to install products differently, but we need to shift our thinking to performance. If you need to carry water from point A to point B, who cares what the pipe is made out of, as long as it carries the water from point A to point B. Like, we need to think about function and performance, and stop worrying about what the material is and think about what the job that the thing needs to do is.
Yeah, such an important point you make around performance, right? Because I think, as we start to look at, of course, what the outcomes are that we want to achieve, then it's really in that particular way in which we start to think about recycling. And of course, the value in use is what we're talking about.
That's right. And making something, thinking about the products differently opens your mind to maybe exploring all sorts of new products, because if you're thinking about the job that you want the product to do rather than the material, you're focusing on a different problem.
Yeah, very interesting. I just remember in the early days when we were starting to do a lot of work with our green steel technology, and of course, the kind of the traditional sort of thinking that, okay, well, if a steel making furnace has always used, coal-based input, surely anything else that you bring in as an alternative is not going to be able to do the job from a metallurgical point of view in that furnace. But actually, where that myth was busted, it was, if you look at the lab results that, we were even able to show, it was really very clear that we were, you talk about performance, that if you can measure that performance.
Yeah.
What gets measured gets done, as we all know.
That's right.
So I think to be able to measure it and to prove
And
that.
what we measure matters,
Yeah, exactly right. I can see some questions already coming up. And interestingly, question is around how you're tracking, or measuring the use of recycled materials on your projects.
So we ask all of our contractors to prepare recycled first plans. So the recycled first policy, you've probably heard me talk about it before. It only has two requirements. One is to optimise the use of recycled content, and the second one is we will put those commitments that you make in your contract and you'll report against them. So we're collecting a whole rich sort of data set through the recycled first plans. If people, if our projects are not using recycled content, we want them to tell us why. We want them to tell us it's too expensive or they couldn't find one. We want them, make them write it down, the reason why you're not using recycled material. And the commitments that you do make will go in your contracts, and we'll hold you to account for those commitments and track, volumes and the like through that.
So it's interesting. I mean, you're almost, in a proactive way, asking people and encouraging people to think about those alternatives. And if there are barriers, cost or what have you, safety. I mean, that's again, we again always assume that traditional materials are just always going to be better.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily always the case.
No.
Are there examples where you can sort of point out where you've achieved, kind of better outcomes?
I think the St Kilda Road project that Kev had in his slides is a really good example of a product that was developed that's lighter, faster to install. The original program for that project was set assuming that we would have to use bluestone because of the heritage that Kev referenced along, St Kilda Road's one of Melbourne's, iconic boulevards, and, the look and feel of it is really important. And so we based it on using bluestone. And then what happened, using the recycled alternative, 6 months was shaved off the program. So, time is money in projects. So if you can save time because things are faster or easier, lighter to install, the noise walls on the Morty Alec Freeway, you don't need a big crane to lift concrete panels into place. You can use much smaller equipment, and in terms of handling, truckloads, anything lighter and faster is definitely going to have flow-on safety benefits.
Yeah, and in the long term, I guess a lot of these kinds of solutions, as you start to drive innovative products and materials into new applications, you're also going to be thinking towards that bigger picture. If the world is wanting to decarbonize, you have to be able to use lower carbon materials.
That's right.
And so the fact that you're talking about alternatives to concrete, for instance, in this particular project. I mean, are there ways in which businesses and projects can start to proactively, kind of monitor the savings in their carbon footprint? Do you feel that's going to be?
Absolutely. Decarbonisation is definitely high on the agenda for us, and we need to start counting. Because what we count matters, and so we need to start measuring better.
Yeah.
Our focus when we started the ecologiQ program was really about what can we do with waste, but now we're starting to see some real tangible carbon benefits in some of the products. So yeah, definitely we need to do more in that front.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, there's that obvious other side that we have to keep materials out of landfill. I mean, there is
That's
no
right.
question about that, because if you start to put a lot of these materials into landfill, you're going to have some kind of plastics, for example, that people know are going to, sit in landfill. They're going to degrade. They're going to lead to pollution.
Yep.
Is there also something, as you're saying, to be able to measure the positive outcomes of your actions? So it's not just sort of saying, well, we're doing this because we love to implement greener projects. Now, that's, of course, a given. That's what we're here talking about.
I find the term diversion from landfill interesting because how do you know it was going to end up in a hole? I don't know. It's a funny concept, but that's the only way we have to measure the volume that we're using. But I think, there's a lot of people that say you're just turning all the infrastructure into horizontal landfills, but that's not necessarily true either. Because like I said before, what the material is shouldn't really matter as long as it you know, it functions. You know, if you want a noise wall to attenuate noise and you don't want it to blow over in the wind and you want to clean the graffiti off it, and there's a product that can do that, then great. So I think, yeah, the landfill criticism is not necessarily deserved.
Well, you know, I mean, it is interesting. We talk about, you know, ultimately when you think about taking virgin resources out of the ground, you know, you think about simple things that we do in terms of where materials initially have come from. And so you start to think about all kinds of metals. You know, minerals have been mined, they've been processed. You know, simple example like steel. You know, you've done that already. So the fact that you've put in all of that embodied carbon and energy into making that material in the first instance.
Keep it in circulation.
Keep it in circulation.
For as long as possible before it goes in a hole.
Exactly. And it's quite interesting that, you know, we shouldn't be thinking about this kind of hole in the ground as if that's a viable option at all. Because when we're talking about circularity and circular solutions, we're also, as we were connecting that decarbonization as part of that thinking. The amount of energy that you've put into making a material in the first place, whether it is our plastics or ceramics or metal, in all of these cases, once that material has been made, once that product has been made, yes, the product might no longer be fit for that particular application, but it can be pulled back out of one infrastructure project.
And you hear a lot of people talk about the reprocessing and the emissions associated with processing recycled material. But like you say, it exists. So getting more virgin materials has impacts.
Yes.
So let's just use this.
Exactly, because I think often in some of the work that we do as well, you know, people sort of often have that question to us. Oh, but, you know, therefore aren't you putting so much more energy into recycling something and repurposing? But you're actually forgetting that, you know, what is that baseline you're comparing with? That baseline could well be that if you go after more raw materials that have got to be, you know, brought out of mine sources and they have to be processed to then be able to convert it.
And I think that goes back to the cost question as well. Like, you know, we need to break the way we think about the cost of materials because the initial cost to buy something is only one part of the story. And we need to think about cost of landfill, you know, the cost to the environment, the emissions associated, the transport. Like, we need to think about the whole life of the product and the material, not just the initial capital cost.
That's right.
Which, you know, in some cases can be a little bit high at the start, but what phone or TV or technology was ever cheap on day one? Like, nothing was ever cheap on day one. We get a product, we prove it, the demand goes up, the production goes up, you know, the manufacturing, the efficiencies, the, you know, the standardisation, and then the per unit cost will naturally come down.
And is there something in there in that part of that thinking around if we're talking circularity and circular economy and bringing in some of that ethos around, you know, how do you encourage local businesses, supporting local businesses? I mean, it's so inspiring to walk through the trade hall to be able to see
it's really cool.
So many people I mean, that example was awesome around, I think Steve's example of the bollards, that in 12 months, you know, they've gone from being a prototype
to selling them.
It's
cool, isn't it?
That is pretty cool. I mean, to think of the fact that you guys did that in 12 months, that's...
I didn't do it. Steve did it wherever Steve is.
Well, it sounds like, you know, we're kind of running out of time for audience questions. So, you know, I'm just going to let everyone know that, look, I'm sorry that we are running a bit out of time, but we will, of course, note the questions and certainly we'll make sure that there'll be time to pick up on some of your questions and commentary through, of course, as we have more and more of these panel discussions coming through. I wanted to sort of maybe just perhaps come to some of the critical sort of things that as a government entity, because often sometimes when people are talking about, you know, hey, what's the government doing? You know, how can the government change that mindset? And we were starting to, I mean, listening to what Kevin said this morning and yourself.
I think, what we're doing in Victoria seems to be quite unique, and And, you know, the success of the Recycled First policy has really been, it can really be attributed to the wraparound support that is provided by the ecologiQ team. And Kev's added pillars to my list, but you know, that technical leadership and that go-to place. Like some people we've heard from say now they just know who to call in government. Government can be a murky place, you know, even from the inside. And so just having somewhere to go that you know people can get directed to the right place inside government. And so I'd really encourage everyone to look at the Knowledge Hub. You know, sharing and collaboration are words that keep on coming up. And, you know, there are tools available. The team's here, ring me. You know, we're here to help. And that's why we think that we've gone from sort of introducing a policy to seeing impacts in such a short space of time, which is quite unique.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've really certainly learned a lot from listening to what you and Kevin are talking about in terms of, you know, where the future is really looking very bright and optimistic. And I think that key word of connections and collaborations keeps coming up. So I do want to say thank you so much for everything you guys are doing here. And I guess time's up, so we're going to kind of get you and me off the stage.
I'm happy to get off here, don't worry.
And I want to say thanks so much, and please join with me in thanking Alexis.
Thanks.